Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Tuesday, the 6th, where we are talking about introductions, conclusions, and transitions, as well as language, as we prepare for our upcoming speeches. And as you know, your first speech will be this upcoming Thursday. It an autobiographical speech in which you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, and I'm hopeful that at this point you've got some sense of how you're going to approach speech number one. And while you are working on your outlines, which is something that I had talked about last class, you want to put particular attention to the introduction, the conclusion. And that's not to say that the discussion section or the body is not important, but as we were talking about people having poor listening and poor memory skills, there's something called the primary recency effect. Basically, people tend to remember best what they're exposed to first and last. You can test this theory perhaps if you wanted to reflect upon an important event in your life, perhaps a vacation, and chances are you remember the beginning and the ending more clearly than you remember the middle. But nevertheless, because of this effect, it is a good idea to put a little bit of extra attention into your introduction and your conclusion because of first and last impressions. So there are lots of different ways that you can organize an introduction and conclusion. Just like last class, we were talking about that there are lots of different ways in which you can organize the main arguments of a speech. And once again, chances are that if you've utilized many of the techniques that I'm going to suggest, that the textbook has also suggested for an introduction and or conclusion. The good news is that it works both ways so that you can mix and match. And the first is reality. So if you're talking about something that is real or true to life, chances are people will listen more attentively. This is why news stories oftentimes tend to capture interest. Proximity, things that are nearby. So the idea that you have got a greater interest in those things that are closer or that are more closely related to your life. Familiarity. And yet also what will grab attention is novelty. And it seems like those two are in direct opposition to one another, but not necessarily. If you want to think about the idea that human beings are filled with paradox, and certainly we want what's familiar because it's comforting and that piques our interest, but also we want something that's new so that we aren't bored. Suspense and conflict, and the media does this very well, and news organizations do this very well to try to get our attention. Humor, and again, humor is very culturally based, so what might be funny for one group of individuals may not necessarily be humorous for another group of individuals, so one needs to be cautious about that. That which is vital or important, just stating that something is important already gives it a sense of importance. Question and answers, we were talking about last class. Quotation. Now, you want to make sure that you are giving a valid quotation, and I always suggest that you tell your audience ahead of time if you're going to be quoting, just because of an experience I had in listening to a student's speech a few years ago, where the student started with a very lengthy quote, which is fine, but because they didn't tell us that it was a quote, we had assumed that the student was going to read their entire speech because they were reading the quote. And if they had just told us ahead of time that they were going to begin with a quote, then we wouldn't have feared that they would be reading the speech in its entirety. Lots of resources for quotes, and of course, everybody goes to the internet. But as you know, just going on the internet doesn't necessarily mean that you've got something that's valid. So you want to do some fact checking. If you've ever heard of the source Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, it's almost like Webster's Dictionary in many respects. It is very esteemed, and it's organized much like a dictionary based on topics in alphabetical order, and then you would choose your topic, and then you would find multiple quotations that would be related to that particular topic. And of course, there are other resources that you can use out there, but I've seen many quotes on the internet that have been misquoted or even just fabricated. So you want to make sure that you're verifying your quote. Storytelling and illustration. People love stories. It's one of the things I talk about in my literature and film class. People want to be able to see stories about themselves and also be able to see stories about people that they don't have connections or experiences with. So that's one of the great powers of storytelling. Personal references and intentions. So, just talking about yourself oftentimes piques an audience's interest. So, even though your informative speech is teaching us about something, you may use autobiographical elements in it. And I've always suggested that the divisions I've given you for your speeches are somewhat artificial, because chances are, regardless of the speech you give, there's some probability that you'll mention something about yourself, something that's autobiographical. And if you're giving a persuasive speech, you're obviously going to need to give information to help persuade us. And I think there's a persuasive element to all speeches that, if nothing else, whatever you're talking about has a certain level of validity and importance. So, again, I see these as somewhat artificial divisions in many respects. A startling statement, which can be very useful, but you need to be very, very careful. I think I've shared with you the student who tried to disrobe during his speech. I can't remember if I shared with you a speech that was given in one of my classes during break or towards the ending of the break, where we were all basically looking at our notes, or and this was actually before cells, and or perhaps we were talking with other people, but somebody in the back of the room began to choke. And I was at the front of the room going through my notes, and I remember everything seemingly starting to stand still as I was rising up to get to the choking student and thinking to myself, I need to call security. Do I remember the Heimlich maneuver? And ultimately, another student approached the choking victim and performed the Heimlich, and out popped a rolled ball of paper. Quite surreal. And the person who had performed the Heimlich calmly walked up to the front of the class, because it turns out that after the break it was their turn to deliver their speech. It was an informative speech. And what they shared with us is that what we had just witnessed was a simulation of a choking. But if it had been a true choking, would we have known what to do? And that speech was going to be about the Heimlich maneuver. And of course, everybody was listening with rapt attention by that point, myself included. It was really a wonderful way to startle the audience into paying attention. Yes, there was some risk involved. Something could have gone wrong. If somebody else had got into the, quote, victim, unquote, performed the Heimlich, I mean, they could actually have performed some damage on the individual. Or if the individual who was, quote, choking, unquote, actually began to choke on that piece of paper, I wonder how the other student would have responded, and just assumed that our choking victim was a very good actor and not taken any real steps to try to prevent any kind of choking situation. But as I said, all of it had been planned out ahead of time, and that these were two friends who were taking the class together, and they had made sure that right after the break, the student would be delivering their speech, and when no one was paying attention, the victim would put a rolled ball of paper in his mouth, and the other student would rush up and pretend to perform the Heimlich. So sometimes startling your audience can be very effective. But again, you've got to be careful. Forecasting and summarizing, just telling the audience what you're going to talk about, talking about it, and then reminding us what you talked about. Issuing a challenge. This can be very useful, again, if for a persuasive speech you wanted us to take some kind of action. On page 129, there's a graphic that you might be interested in that talks a little bit about introductions, conclusions, and transitions. And the last chapter that I wanted to talk about today is about language. And the thing with the speech is that your language is going to be much more informal, at least the kinds of speeches that we're delivering. So you're not held to the level of formality that you would be when you're writing a paper. We want to be conversational. And when we're conversational, we use simpler vocabulary, we use shorter sentences, we're less formal, And the idea is to try to be accurate, to try to be simple, and also to restate because, again, people have notoriously poor memories. And there are lots of different ways that you can use language. Once you become comfortable with some of the elements of public speaking, you can do things like play around with definitions. I suppose the most obvious definition is the denotation of a word, the dictionary definition, but words also come with connotations, which are associations with those words. So two words can have two similar dictionary definitions. For instance, two words like cheap and frugal basically mean you're not spending a lot of money. However, one has a positive association, frugal, and assumes intelligence. One has a negative association, cheap, which assumes stinginess, which again has a negative association. You can give a negative definition. Rather than defining what something is, you can define what something is not. So, for instance, by rich, I don't mean somebody who has a lot of money. I mean somebody who has health and happiness. So, basically, what I've done is I've given you another definition that you wouldn't necessarily find in Webster's. And definitions are influenced by context. So, a contextual definition determined by situation. When I talk about brief in a writing class, I'm talking about being concise. But if I were talking about brief in a fashion class, I'd probably be talking about an article of clothing. And if I were talking about brief in a law class, I could very easily be talking about a legal report. So, again, it depends on the context. Etymological definitions, the historical definitions of words can be fascinating as well if you want to get a sense as to how a word developed over time and how it was created. So you can have definitions that are analogies, basically they're comparisons with the two, definitions that show examples, um, and some of the more advanced techniques when you are thinking about language, using as many metaphors and similes and rhymes as possible to make your language poetic. And some of the great speakers that we think of, usually Martin Luther King immediately comes to mind in his I Have a Dream speech. Um, a metaphor, a simile, a rhyme, all of those are literary techniques. A metaphor is when you are comparing two dissimilar things without using like or as. If you're using like or as, then that's a simile. And a rhyme is when the endings of the words sound the same. Alliteration is when the beginnings of the words sound the same. Using imagery is very useful, something to represent something else, a symbol or an image, because it can be very sensory and assist with visualization. In terms of your tone, think about being audience centered, doing what's appropriate with your audience, and trying to be as neutral, as culturally sensitive, and inclusive as possible. But again, you don't want to get to the point where you're so afraid to speak that you're not able to deliver a message. So, I do know that I speak differently than I write. So, while I would perhaps write about a firefighter, my suspicion would be if I were ever in an emergency, I would yell out for a fireman. And yes, I know that it should be a firefighter, but again, old habits die hard. The idea is just to be as inclusive as possible without holding yourself to being exact in your language. Remember, keywords and phrases in your outline, you're being conversational. I almost liken it to preparing for an important conversation, perhaps asking your employer for a raise. Chances are you've rehearsed some of your main points, and when you get to the boss's office, you already know which points you're going to address, but again, you haven't memorized it, and it's not something that you're going to be reading to your boss. It's going to be a conversation. And of course, things could change based on your boss's responses to your arguments. Next class, we get to talk about delivery and the different kinds of speeches that exist, but we are talking about the extempore, or we are talking about speeches that are not extemporaneous, which are in the moment, and we're talking about speeches that are not memorized, which have their place sometimes, usually for very short and formal affairs. Think of something like a wedding, for instance. And we're not talking about a manuscript speech either. And a manuscript speech would be a speech that's read. Oftentimes, this is done in academic conferences or, let's say, in media situations where you're timed down to the second. But we'll talk about that and eye contact and body language, the importance of also practice, and you will have your first quiz as well because there's only one chapter that we will be discussing. So the time we would be discussing the second chapter is when you would be taking the first quiz. It'll be 20 questions, multiple choice, some true, false, some short answers, open book, open notes. So basically, you should be able to find the information through the text and the class videos. And the idea is that this is reinforcing some of the major points of the semester that we've been discussing to help us get ready for Thursday, the 8th, which is speech number 1. So, next class, in addition to talking about delivery and practice and quiz number 1, I'm also going to give you the instructions for how you would post speech number 1 onto our Moodle site, which you will be pre-recording. And on the 8th is when you will be uploading your speech number 1, which is your autobiographical speech. So, what I wanted to leave with you today are 3 sample autobiographical student speeches for you to watch. You can see this in the section underneath the videos labeled as section 4. Watch 3 sample autobiographical student speeches. These are just speeches that I found on YouTube that students had posted. Obviously, these students were not delivering these speeches for our class, so things like time we couldn't necessarily comment on because they didn't necessarily have to follow a 5-minute limit. But we could comment on things like body language and introductions and conclusions and so forth and so on. One of the speeches that you'll be seeing is very much culturally based because it is done in a military setting, and definitely the military is a culture in and of itself. Another speech you can see where somebody delivered it at home. And the third speech, as you can see, it was recorded in a classroom. So I will have you watch all 3 speeches. And your attendance question for today, which will be due Thursday the 8th, is to list 1 strength and 1 weakness from each of the sample 3 speeches that I'm asking you to watch, the 3 sample autobiographical speeches. Again, you're not required to respond to your classmates, though you are encouraged to, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. So, I hope you are doing well. I'm doing well. I will leave you to watch these sample autobiographical speeches and answer the attendance question. And next class, we will talk about speech delivery and practice, as well as have our first quiz. Take care. Bye-bye.